Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hopwood. I'm a senior pollinator conservation specialist with Xerces Society. I'm based in Omaha and have been with Xerces about 10 years doing various aspects of pollinator conservation work, and I'm really excited to be a part of this project today. I am going to be talking with you about bumblebee value, conservation, their status, and their ecology here in Nebraska. And as we talk through this, if you've got questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll answer questions as we go along. So as you heard from Katie, bees are incredibly efficient and important pollinators, and bumblebees in particular are really important pollinators. There are a number of reasons that make them really valuable pollinators. They are able to fly when many other insects aren't, so they're active at times when others aren't out there pollinating flowers. They can visit a wide range of flowers. They're very intelligent, and they can adapt how they access resources and learn from their experiences. So I mentioned that they are flying when a lot of other insects aren't. Most insects rely on ambient temperature to be able to move, to be able to fly. So does anybody like to take photographs of insects? Yeah, and the best time to do it is cool, when it's early in the morning or late in the evening when those little buggers aren't flitting about really fast. So they move really slow in cooler temperatures. But for bumblebees, they can actually generate their own body heat. They will vibrate their thoracic muscles, their wing muscles, and that allows them to generate enough heat to be able to fly in quite cool temperatures. And in fact, to keep their colony warm under very cool temperatures as well. So you can see bumblebees flying early in the morning when not much else is out and about, into late through into dusk. They even fly sometimes in light rain and cloudy conditions and windy conditions, and this means that they are pollinating when many other things aren't. And when you live in a variable climate, like you find here in Nebraska, that's really important for flowers. They can't just expect pollination on the sunniest, most perfect of warm days. Katie mentioned that bumblebees have a variety of tongue lengths, and this allows them to access nectar from a variety of plants. And I don't know why the flower didn't show up, but if you've seen flowers like echinacea, which have very open floral structure, they have very shallow nectar reserves, and many, many different insects can get nectar from those flowers because they have small mouth parts. Bumblebees, in contrast, can not only access nectar from those open floral structures, but they can also access nectar from flowers that have deep nectar reserves, deep within the flower. And again, this allows them to be effective pollinators of a much wider range of flowers. I mentioned that bumblebees can be very intelligent. They can be cognitively flexible, so they can learn to access resources. And in this video, you'll see that researchers have trained bumblebees to access a reward by moving a ball. So what they've done is to show them, they demonstrate to the bumblebee that when this ball is moved to the center, that the bumblebee can access a sugar reward. So the bumblebee has watched that, has learned that. Here she is finding the nectar. And then she'll take that knowledge and apply it in a unique way. So here she is choosing to move that ball on her own in order to access that sugar reward. And here are bumblebees watching other bumblebees move that ball to access the sugar reward and learn from that observation of other bumblebees. And here's where it gets really interesting. Applying that knowledge in unique ways. If a bumblebee is given a choice, she picks the ball that's closest to the center to get her reward the fastest. So what we thought we knew about teeny tiny little insect brains is really just the start. I think we've got a lot to learn about insects and their cognitive abilities. So other ways in which bumblebees' intelligence and their innovation allow them to access floral resources in unique ways. A classic example is buzz pollination. Buzz pollination is really important for a variety of flowers, but particularly for flowers that have pollen up inside the anthers rather than on the outside where it can be dusted off. And that's true for flowers like tomatoes, and for flowers that rely on vibration or sonication to release their pollen grain, they need a bumblebee or another wild bee that can come up and grasp that flower. Bumblebees grab it with their mandibles, and then they use those thoracic muscles, those wing muscles again, to vibrate the flower, and they shake the pollen out of the anthers just like salt from a salt shaker. It falls onto her belly, and she carts it off happily. This buzz pollination is really critical for a number of crop plants, for tomatoes, for peppers, eggplants, blueberries, cranberries, and it's really important for a number of wildflowers. I've got senna blooming in my yard right now. Senna is a bumblebee pollinated plant because it relies on buzz pollination, and shooting star is another great example of a wildflower that needs bumblebees in order to spread the pollen grains. For some crops that rely on buzz pollination, the presence of bumblebees or other wild bees can triple the yield of that crop, and that's the case for cherry tomatoes. So in those systems, it's really important for producers to support wild bees if they want to get their maximum yield. Buzz pollination is not a behavior that honeybees perform, so wild bees in these systems make it even more critical. And for some producers of tomatoes, for example, that are grown in greenhouses, it's of such importance that they will purchase bumblebee colonies to put in the greenhouse. Yes? Yep, yeah, and well, they can self-pollinate. So if they get a little bit of vibration, they can self-pollinate. But it depends on the variety to the extent to which they can benefit from wild pollinators also. Yep, and that's true of other crop plants like eggplants and peppers too. Yeah, excellent question. Just as a kind of side note related to that, some researchers decided that they wanted to do taste tests between tomatoes that were pollinated by bumblebees and tomatoes that were pollinated in greenhouses and pollinated with electric toothbrushes to vibrate the flowers and spread the pollen. And lo and behold, there is a significant taste preference in people that prefer the bumblebee pollinated tomatoes. So here's a quick video of buzz pollination. In this video, you're going to see bumblebees visiting a variety of plants. This is blueberry. You can see she already has a pretty heavy pollen load. And here's the distinct buzz sound that results from buzz pollination. Here on the tomato, you can actually see the pollen falling out onto her belly as she buzzes. So in addition to taking all these smarts that they have a decent size and strength that allows them to utilize different floral resources also. So bumblebees can be really important pollinators to flowers like bottle gentian, which bloom here in the next couple weeks, that have close petals and need a strong, large bumblebee or other insect who can open up those petals and crawl down inside. The nectar is located deep inside this flower. So if you take bumblebees out of a system, there are quite a number of wild plants that may disappear as well. And as foragers, bumblebees that are out from spring to fall, they visit such a wide range of flowers. They're a really critical staple of pollination systems. So I'm going to tell you a little bit, and I apologize for this clicker and my ability to click it forward. I'm going to tell you a little bit about bumblebee ecology. Bumblebees do have, because they have the ability to warm themselves up, they can survive in climates that other insects cannot. And in fact, bumblebees are more diverse in cooler climates and at higher altitudes, which is really in contrast to a lot of different plants and animals that get more diverse as you get to warmer, more moist climates, like towards the equator. Bumblebees are actually more diverse here in Nebraska than they are in Texas. And so they are exceptionally diverse in mountainous areas, coastal climates, And as Katie mentioned, we have about 20 species here in Nebraska. We have some species that you can only find on the eastern third of the state, here in Lincoln and eastward. We have some species you can only find in the western portions of the state, and then we have some species that occur across the whole range. And unlike the majority of bees that are native to the US, bumblebees are not solitary. They don't have one female that's creating her own nest and provisioning her own nest. They are social, so they make small colonies. And these colonies are founded by a queen. She's the reproductive individual. Her offspring, particularly the workers, the females, her daughters, help build the colony, and they perform specific roles within the colony. So they might guard the colony, they might forage for other food, they help raise young. And the males basically gad about on flowers. The colony has an annual life cycle, so unlike honeybees, which do live through the winter on their honey stores and have a queen that lives several years, bumblebees have an annual cycle that starts in the spring and ends in the fall. And colonies can range in size. This very much depends on species and also resources available. So some species reach peak colony size of about 25 individuals, and other species like the common eastern bumblebee can reach quite large sizes of several hundred individuals. Bumblebees nest in messy places, really, both above ground and below ground. And what we may think might be an ideal nest source is not always what they think is an ideal nest source. The life cycle starts with the queen, and in the springtime, the queen, which mated the previous fall, emerges. She emerges from hibernation very, very hungry because she's already used up her food sources. If she's lasted that long throughout the winter, her fat stores are really low, so she's really at that point vulnerable and really needs early spring blooming flowers. So wild shrubs and trees that bloom in the springtime are really absolutely critical for queen bumblebees. And as soon as she builds back up her energy, her job is to find a nest location. She finds her nest, she begins to provision that nest with pollen and nectar. She secretes some wax and creates this little honey pot, which is a temporary nectar store. And then she lays her eggs, covers them with wax, and she sits on them and incubates them, much like a chicken incubates eggs. And that incubation is incredibly important because, as we know, in springtime in Nebraska, it's not always mild temperatures. And the more that she can incubate, she can speed up the development of her young, not just her eggs hatching into larvae, but speeding up larval development as well. So once she's had her first brood, it's ideal if she can stay in her nest and warm them up with her body temperature. If she needs to leave to get more nectar for more energy or more pollen to feed her larvae, then that can delay the development of her young a little bit. And it's important, of course, that she can have those workers as fast as possible so that then they can go out and contribute to the health of the colony by bringing in more food sources. Yeah. There's a variety of parental care, but incubation is pretty unusual because bumblebees can generate their own body heat. There's sort of a classic story of a bumblebee scientist who needed to kill a commercial colony that he'd purchased. He put it in the freezer and decided to come back a day later. And when he opened it up, lo and behold, there was still that colony just buzzing about because they generate their own heat in order to keep the colony to survive. So it survived 24 hours in the freezer. But yeah, it's an interesting form of parental care. So the colony grows and grows and grows with workers, and it reaches its peak right about now or a little bit earlier in the summertime. And then males are produced as the queen starts to run out of sperm. They produce males, they produce new queens. Those queens and males leave the nest, find mates. And then as the summer and fall progresses, the males die off, the old workers die off, and the old queens die off. And in the fall, you're left with new queens that are mated, and they spend quite a lot of time foraging around, trying to build up their fat stores so they can make it through our winters. And I mentioned that spring is a very vulnerable time for queen bumblebees. If you think about it, one queen bumblebee really represents several hundred individual bumblebees, so she's really valuable. And in spring, she has to find food, and she has to find a nest location for her colony. Because the future population depends on her ability to find a good nest site, she puts a lot of effort into it. And occasionally, queen bumblebees will fight each other when they find that right spot. They will defend themselves. So they might select a site depending on the species. If they have a preference above ground, they'll select a site in an old bird's nest, an old bird house, in tree cavities, in grass thatch, below ground in old rodent nests, somewhere that's insulated, an existing insulated, that's really warm.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent question. I suppose it depends on when in that spring season you burn. And you're a couple of slides ahead of me, which is fantastic. When queens overwinter, they tend to overwinter in shallow layers of soil or shallow duff, leaf litter. And so if you burn when they're still overwintering, that has the potential to destroy some of the queens. If you're burning later in the spring, they might have already emerged and the queens are not at risk. But the colony itself, if the queen has already established it in the litter area, then fire can be a risk. But I think like any other land management method, it's a balance because that fire can be so critical for systems. So limiting fire to a portion of the system at a time it can be really important in those systems. So I guess I'm saying that any type of management can have risks for bumblebees, but you can't stop managing habitat also. So that's an important question. So when they've got their nest established, they lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch really quickly into larvae. The larvae feed on pollen and nectar that's provided for them by the queens or workers. Then they enter their resting stage, that pupal stage, where they completely rearrange their bodily tissues. They change from this little critter right here into a bumblebee, and then they emerge as adults. And as I mentioned, the colonies continue to grow and grow and grow. This, from egg to adult, can take about a month, depending on floral resources available and temperature also. In the fall, right about now, males are out and about, and males have several strategies for finding new queens. Some species perch up on tall flowers on top of hills, and they have large eyes, and they seek around searching for queens. Some others follow scent trails. Some find nest openings, and they sit by those nest openings and wait for new queens to emerge. And once they mate, they really just spend the rest of their time hanging around drinking nectar. Males don't play any role in contributing to protection of colony or providing resources. Their role in the bee world is pretty minimal. And a couple things about the mating period. Not all colonies produce new queens. To be able to produce queens, the colony has to be pretty healthy and pretty stable. So if it's been a rough summer with a drought, for example, with less floral resources, then the colonies may not produce queens, in which case that has population impacts for the next year. Another interesting thing about bumblebees and also bees and other relatives in the order Hymenoptera is that female bees can choose the sex of their offspring, choose what types of offspring they're going to have when they lay their eggs. So when queen bumblebees lay their eggs, they put a lot of energy into laying female eggs first, and their female eggs are fertilized. So you have an egg that comes with the queen bee's genetic material, and you have sperm that comes from her mate. And that results in a worker bee or a new queen. But males are the result of an unfertilized egg. So after the queen has used up her stores of sperm about midsummer or so, then she starts producing these unfertilized males. And that system with males just having one source of genetic material just from the queen, they're each genetically distinctive individuals, but they just have genetic material from the queen, does have consequences for conservation genetics because it can lead to some inbreeding problems if populations get too small. But I kind of like to say that that male bees don't have fathers and they don't have sons, but they do have grandfathers and they do have grandsons. So their material can get passed on, but it's just sort of a circuitous route. So once queens have mated, they spend a lot of time on flowers, finding lots of nectar, eating pollen for protein, basically just getting as fat as they possibly can because they need all that energy to make it through the winter. And they overwinter in leaf litter, in shallow soil, and probably a lot of other places we don't know. This is a definite knowledge gap for us. So if you happen to observe queens emerging in the springtime, that's information that we do like to know, and we've been trying to track at Xerces. But I mentioned that sometimes bumblebees may end up overwintering or nesting in places that we don't necessarily think of. I live in an older house in Omaha, and my garage is built on cinder blocks. It's pretty simple. And in the springtime, I often find queen bumblebees emerging from the cinder blocks because they've got contact in the soil with the inside of the cinder blocks. Yes. Actually, yeah, it means northern-facing slopes. That's a really excellent question because the danger of a south-facing slope is it warms up on a sunny but too cold day. And so bumblebee queen emergence has to be balanced with emerging at the time when flowering plants are likely to be blooming, but not emerging so early that there's nothing for them to eat. And that's certainly going to be a challenge as our climate shifts further and further. So what's very interesting about bumblebee life cycles is that there are some nest parasites of bumblebees, a variety of other insects parasitize bumblebees, but there are also other species of bumblebees that parasitize bumblebees. In Nebraska, of our 20 species, there are 4 species that are nest parasites, and we call them cuckoo bumblebees. And these cuckoo bumblebees emerge in late spring, midsummer, just about at colony peak or just before colony peak. And they enter bumblebee nests of their host species and they fight the queen, they remove the queen, they usurp the colony, and they lay their own eggs and have the workers rear their eggs happily. So from that point forward, the nest produces offspring of this cuckoo bumblebee. These cuckoo bees don't have any pollen-carrying structures, and Katie will talk a little bit more about those later today, because they have no need to carry pollen, because they aren't doing any work. They don't create the nest, they don't gather food, they just bully themselves in there and take over. And they have extra strong exoskeletons and they have reinforced stingers, and that's all part of their defense system. What's really amazing is that we have 4 species of these cuckoo bees in Nebraska. That's about 20% of our species, and about 20% of all bee species are cuckoo bees. So it's a pretty diverse chunk of species that are these parasite species. And these parasitic species are really only found when you have a stable enough and large enough population of host bees to be able to support them. So they're a sign of a healthy bee community. And I mentioned that there are distinct emergence times in Nebraska. These are the 8 main common species found in this portion of the state. And this data comes from LaBerge and Webb. The purple color represents the emergence of queen bumblebees. They start to emerge, according to his data, in April and into May. And then at that point, they stay within the nest. The bees that you see out on flowers in the summertime are all worker females, typically. And then around this time here in the fall, you see workers as well as males, as well as new queens. And then dropping off later in the fall, you'll typically just see new queens. What's particularly interesting about this data, which comes from data that he collected in the 40s, 50s, and 60s across the state, is that based on Doug's observations, the time frame has shifted forward significantly. So Doug's found that rather than emerging in mid-April into May, bumblebee queens now emerge mid-March into mid-April. So everything sort of shifted forward by about a month and extended into October, in some cases all the way to November. All right, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the status of bumblebees. Particularly in the last 20 years, it's become apparent that there are multiple species of bumblebees that are in decline. Striking declines were really first noted with the 4 bumblebees seen up here on the screen: the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, Bombus franklini, Franklin's bumblebee, found in a small portion of California and southern Oregon, Bombus tricola, the yellow-banded bee, and the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis. And really right about the same time, all 4 of these populations started to crash. In the case of the rusty patch bumblebee, it was one of the most common species across its range, which extends from northern Maine down south to the Carolinas, west over to Iowa, and up over into North Dakota just a little bit. And it's now just restricted to a couple different states in the Midwest, no longer found in the Northeast, like a 95% range contraction within 20 years. Bombus franklini was last seen in 2006 and suspected that it could be extinct, but earlier this week was listed under endangered, offered protection under the Endangered Species Act. The Bombus tricola actually related to the Endangered Species Act. A listing decision came out earlier this week and they decided not to list it as threatened or endangered. But all 4 of these bees crashed around the same time. And when these crashes occurred, bumblebee scientists took note and starting in 2011, formed a specialist group under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this specialist group included experts worldwide, including some experts on our staff who contributed to using strict quantitative criteria to assess bumblebee populations in order to determine their status. And as Katie mentioned, the result of that status assessment here in North America is that we have 25% of our bumblebee species that fall into a category that indicates that they're at risk of extinction. So that includes vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered species based on this IUCN criteria. So what are the threats that bumblebees are facing? Why are they having these huge declines? And why is it happening so suddenly? And Katie showed this cartoon. There are lots of different threats that bumblebees face. And in some ways, just as with honeybee declines, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. It's not just pressure from one source. It's multiple sources and interacting sources, and sometimes as well. One particular very fundamental threat is the threat of habitat loss. We know that bumblebees need a huge supply of pollen and nectar starting in the spring, going all the way through the fall. So they need a diversity of sources of plants, and they need a place to have their colony. So if in this type of landscape where you have vegetative diversity, you've got plenty of flowering wildflowers, you have shrubs, you have trees, you have grass. This is a very different landscape than a landscape that's been converted for single crop agriculture. In this type of landscape, there's very limited sources of food, and because of the annual nature of harvesting that crop and planting that crop, there's a lot of disturbance. So colonies can't survive in this landscape successfully, and they don't have enough food. So that shift has a lot of impact. And living in the northern Corn Belt, our habitat has changed quite a lot, even in the last 20 years with conversion of ancient field borders and ancient tree plantings and shelter belts. A lot of those have been removed recently to make more room for row crops. It's not just agricultural landscapes, though, that have changed and altered. From a more natural suburban environment, that's shifted to more and more development. And as we increase the use of lawns, and as we have more impervious surfaces in our urban areas, that's less and less habitat for bumblebees and for wildlife. Yes? Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know of any records of bumblebees using bark mulch to nest in. It's from a broader bee perspective. solitary bees or semi-solitary bees that nest in the ground need access to ground, so thick layers of bark mulch can impede their ability to build nests. I could see potentially that bumblebee queens might be able to dig in and overwinter, but again, I don't have any research to draw from there. I don't think that is something that can be looked at as an equivocally beneficial conservation action. I think it's got some issues. Yeah, I love that you all are jumping ahead slides. It's wonderful. It's fantastic, absolutely. We have the slogan, leave the leaves, and piling up in specific parts of your yard underneath trees, for example. Leaf mulch is hugely valuable for gardens and yards and so forth. So if you can pile it on your vegetable garden or under your trees or shrubs, that's a place for bumblebees to overwinter. It's a place for other butterflies to overwinter, for lady beetles to overwinter. It's wonderful habitat. So yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. I could go on and on about leaves. But I do want to kind of hammer this home a little bit more. Lawns are great habitat for Japanese beetles and other lawn pests, but they are not great habitat for much else. So this conversion can have a big impact. And aside from habitat loss, insecticide use can be a big threat to bumblebees. Broadly speaking, bumblebees don't have the same capacity to detoxify insecticides and other chemicals in their body that honeybees do. So honeybees are a little bit more resilient to some chemicals that can really cause a lot of harm to bumblebees. So that's sort of the broader picture. And what we've got pictured up here on the screen is a map that demonstrates insecticide use of a particular chemical, imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid insecticide, as it was adopted in the early 90s and moving into now. This chemical, this is just agricultural use that you see pictured here, and you can see that it was widely adopted, particularly in our area, our neck of the woods. This chemical was widely adopted because it could be applied in a variety of ways. It's a systemic chemical, so you can apply it as a root drench, you can apply it as a seed coating, you can spray it on a plant, and the chemical will be incorporated up into the root structure and up into the vascular tissue and into the leaf tissue itself. So when you've got a sucking insect like an aphid or a chewing insect like a leaf beetle that eats that plant, it will be targeted by that chemical directly. So people were really excited about this method of delivery of insecticides. It's sort of unique. And they thought that it would mean less exposure to beneficial insects. The downside is that it is in the plant for a long time, can be weeks, months, and even years, depending on the type of plant and how it's been applied. And it also appears in the pollen and nectar. And even if it's in very small quantities, it may not kill a bumblebee, for example, that eats the pollen and nectar outright, but it can significantly impact their foraging ability, even at 2 parts per billion, which is an teensy amount of chemical. It can mean that queens don't produce as many offspring. It can mean that bumblebees get confused as they're searching for food. It can mean that they don't have the ability to insulate the colony properly. So there's been a lot of unintended consequences of insecticide use, and not just in agricultural settings. This is a picture of a parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon. This is a strip mall area, and can you all see in the back these little tiny carcasses on the pavement? This is a picture and the site of what we know to be the largest bumblebee kill due to insecticides. And this happened in the spring underneath these linden trees, basswood trees, which have beautiful big white blossoms, and they're very attractive to a wide range of insects. Are there beekeepers here? Yeah, honeybees love linden trees and basswood trees. It's a really important source of nectar for them, and bumblebees do too, and lady beetles and so forth. These trees were also really attracted to aphids, and the aphids were producing honeydew. It's a byproduct of their digestive system, and it's sticky, and it was dropping onto cars. And managers of the strip mall thought that that was inconvenient, and so they treated these trees to remove the aphids, and they treated them during bloom. So bees came in direct contact with the chemical, and that chemical was then absorbed into the pollen and nectar for quite some time. So the outcome was acute toxicity to thousands and thousands of bumblebees. Here's what a parking spot looked like. And here's what a square foot of bumblebees looked like. Our colleague Rich Hatfield estimated that about 50,000 bumblebees were killed in this instance. That might be as many as 500 colonies. So it's a huge radius of area that that was knocked out in a couple days. Aside from insecticide use and habitat loss, climate change is also having an impact on bumblebees and will continue to have an impact on bumblebees. Bumblebees that live at various altitudes are going to be impacted as climates change and shift northward. There's going to be less habitat as these mountainous areas change in temperature. Here in Nebraska, where it's predicted that in 50 to 100 years, our climate will begin to look quite a lot like Oklahoma. We're going to have temperature increases of anywhere from 4 to 8 to 10 degrees more. That's going to mean that there are bumblebees that can't live here because they can generate their own body heat. They do have heat tolerance issues. So as our climate gets warmer and warmer and warmer, there are species that we're going to lose. Disease is also an issue for bumblebees. And it's suspected, particularly for those 4 species I showed you a couple slides ago, that they are particularly susceptible to disease. And bumblebee diseases and certainly insect diseases largely is sort of an emerging field that we're learning quite a lot about. But there are a number of pathogens, including a fungus pathogen and a protozoan pathogen, that have a lot of impacts on bumblebees. And it's suspected that these pathogens were amplified in particular by the emergence of the ability to produce commercial bumblebee colonies. You can, now you can order a colony of bumblebees that looks a lot like this. It comes in a box, it comes at peak colony size. And the idea originally was that this would be a service for greenhouse growers where they could put this colony in the greenhouse. It could be self-contained. They could pollinate tomatoes and make them delicious rather than those bad toothbrush pollinated tomatoes. And they wouldn't escape was the thinking. But of course, they did escape, and pathogen load outside of greenhouses on flowers was higher. And we know that pathogens can be transferred on flowers between commercial bumblebees and wild bumblebees. But diseases aren't just transferred between bumblebees, they're also transferred between honeybees and bumblebees as well. Honeybees can transform deformed wing virus, for example, and a gut pathogen. There are also some issues with moving these commercial bumblebees around the United States. The species that's used commercially is the common eastern bumblebee. That's a species that's native to this part of Nebraska. It's native to east of the Rockies. But commercial bumblebees can be shipped anywhere in the United States currently, except in California and Oregon, where they do have restrictions. So in fact, there's the potential that Bombus impatiens will expand its range in places where it may outcompete species in that native range. In fact, we know that it's found up in BC, up in parts of Canada where it didn't used to be found. My goodness. So with all those various threats in mind, I want to talk about conservation efforts and how we can mitigate these threats, because it can feel very overwhelming to think about habitat loss and to think about insecticide use and to think about certainly climate change. But there are all steps that we can all take to make a difference for bumblebees. And it really starts with remembering to protect the habitat that already exists and our natural areas that exist in Nebraska, in this region, are really critical for a lot of reasons. They provide us with clean water, clean air, with all sorts of diverse wildlife. They're certainly a source for unique pollinators and for general pollinators as well. These are the backbones of our landscape. And to your question earlier about managing natural areas, whether it be through prescribed burning or haying or through grazing, considering pollinators and bumblebees when you conduct that management can be also a critical component of helping bumblebees to persist in those natural areas. It also means that in addition to protecting natural areas, we have to think about adding habitat into our landscape in other ways, in the places we work, the places we live, basically everywhere people are, we need more habitat because we need pollinators. So on roadsides, in parks, in yards, in farms, incorporating it wherever we can. And components of bumblebee habitat fall into four main categories: food, shelter, connectivity, and protection from pesticides, particularly insecticides. Food resources, of course, are sources of pollen and nectar. So these can be early blooming species from flowering shrubs, flowering trees, into fall blooming wildflowers. And I mentioned earlier that bumblebees really need that diversity of sources. They need quite a lot of diversity out there. It isn't enough to have just one or two blooming species in any given season. They need multiple species. And having that diversity in the system is really critical for bumblebees and other wildlife too. If you've got years that are drought years where you've got a couple species that drop out. Back in 2012 in particular, we had a really dry early spring, and then there was this period of dearth where there was not a lot blooming. That made it very, very tough for bee populations to survive. Yes. Yeah, excellent question. Thanks so much. How far do bumblebees forage? And we're drawing from limited research, but it can be probably anywhere from 1 mile to 2 miles. That said, they prefer to stay closer to home. So whereas honeybees have designated foragers that will forage for nectar or pollen, and they will forage as far as they can go for miles and miles and miles, because that's all they do within the colony. Bumblebees have other roles too, and so they need to stay closer to home whenever possible, but they're strong flyers. Yeah, so excellent question. When queens are searching for new nest sites, that's sort of an open question. They may be able to forage much, much farther, and that's probably the stage in which range expansion would occur, is in that spring period, is when queens are looking for new nest sites. Any other questions right now about food? I mentioned earlier when speaking about queens how important it is to have spring blooming plants. In Nebraska, a lot of our wildflowers bloom. Some of our ephemeral wildflowers start blooming in late April or May, and it's really critical to have flowering shrubs and flowering trees in the landscape for queens. And it's equally critical to have fall blooming plants as well. They need plenty of food in order to build up their fat stores. So things like willow in the springtime, ranging to goldenrod and asters in the fall, and everything in between. Yes. So far, it seems like yes. But probably one thing that's having a big impact is less the timing and more the bloom period, because as climates are warming in the springtime, plants that used to bloom for weeks are now blooming for just a week because it's gotten so much warmer, so that they just naturally start senescing quicker. And that means that there's overall fewer resources available. So that probably will have consequences. But so far, it looks like the same cues that trigger bees to emerge are the same cues that trigger emergence of flowering plants. Who knows if that maybe become more asynchronous? It's a good question. So in addition to food, shelter is really important. Shelter for nest sites. So these are messy areas, essentially grassy areas that are unmowed when possible, overgrown areas, brush piles, In yards, you may be surprised where bumblebees end up nesting. I have a bumblebee nest underneath my front porch, which is old brickwork. And I found a hole in the brickwork, and of course, underneath the porch, it's open and wonderful and protected, and it's just a wonderful place for them. They also might nest underneath flower pots, in old grills that you haven't touched. It's always a surprise. But they will always pick areas, of course, that are pre-insulated. Connectivity is really important for bumblebees so that they can spend more of their time finding floral resources and less time searching for habitats. So if you're thinking about where to create new habitat, thinking about it in the context of the landscape can be really valuable. Thinking about, for example, in cities, connecting corridors like the Prairie Corridor here or riparian areas where there's existing habitat, connecting those to parks. Thinking about how utility corridors or roadsides can be linear and have the potential for habitat as well. And lastly, protecting habitat from insecticides is really a key component. And this can mean rethinking for, especially in home settings, it can be rethinking the use of insecticides rather than reaching for the bottle of insecticide as a first choice when you see damage on your plant. Assessing whether or not that damage is really important to the life of your plant or to the yield of your garden or your crop. And so that framework is the integrated pest management framework, which allows you to make decisions based on the health of your plant or the yield of your crop. And allows you to use strategies that can control pests without resulting in insecticides. Or when you reach a level at which you must use insecticides, encouraging you to use insecticides in a manner that reduces the risk to pollinators. So not treating flowers in bloom, targeting plants that have the pest issue, not spraying the whole area, using products that are as selective as possible. That means targeting your particular pest if you've got a product available to target. I wish Japanese beetles, for example, and selecting products that have short residuals, so that are short lasting rather than lasting for weeks or months or years. It also means reducing the movement off-site of these insecticides, so applying them under proper weather conditions, making sure that there's a buffer if you're using these sprays on larger scales and so forth, so that they don't move into habitat where bumblebees might be exposed. And I mentioned this earlier, it can also mean rethinking what damage is. In practice, going out, looking at a plant, finding that there are some holes chewed in the leaves, that is damage, but what it really means is there's life using that plant. There's a caterpillar eating it. That caterpillar is going to become a butterfly, or it's going to be food for a bird, which is then going to go forth and perform other roles in the ecosystem. It's part of the system. So when you see holes in your plant, that doesn't mean you have to treat the plant. And thinking about that, especially in the context of our landscapes, damage shouldn't be when there's aphid honeydew dripping from trees and it's a slight inconvenience. That's not when we should be utilizing insecticides. It's not for aesthetic purposes. It's not to protect the health of the plant. It's not to increase yield. That's a use of insecticides that's purely selfish and has really long-lasting consequences for the ecosystem. The last thing, managed pollinators and thinking about where they belong in the landscape is also a component of conservation for bumblebees. And that's because honeybees, while they are an absolutely fascinating insect, and beekeeping can be a very rewarding experience, they don't belong in all landscapes, because placing them in natural areas in particular can pose a risk for bumblebees, because honeybees can transfer diseases to bumblebees. They can also alter pollination networks, because honeybees prefer many European source species because that's what they evolved with. That means that they can perpetuate weed issues sometimes. Honeybees, because they are amazing foragers and because they can connect with each other and communicate where there are the most resources, can significantly compete with native bees because they can send foragers out to swamp patches of valuable resources. And that competition with native bees mean that if you've got rare species in a natural area and you move honeybees in, that can be a risk to those rare species. So considering where you place honeybee hives is a component of bumblebee conservation. Yes, yeah. Yes, they were fined significantly, and it did get a lot of press. And what ended up happening with that in Oregon was that the state Department of Agriculture banned the use of neonicotinoids on linden trees. I think it brought a lot of attention to using insecticides properly, also broadly speaking. Yeah, they had improper use. In that it was a very small fine, $100 or so, but they did improperly apply it during bloom period, yeah, which wasn't allowed by the label. Oh, and I didn't talk about this, but you probably saw the image of the netting on the tree. That was put up because that insecticide is so long lasting that they needed to protect the trees again and again. So and they put up the netting the following year, in fact. So we do have the conservation guidelines available, and it came in with your packets today. Those have more information about land management, balancing land management with bumblebees, and some more information about what we know about bumblebee forage and so forth. If you're interested in guidelines on how to create habitat, Xerces Society has a plethora of information you can download for free. Also, Ray and I are habitat specialists, and our job is to help create habitat. So please feel free to reach out to us about that. Yeah, that was the goal. Just while it was blooming, they put a lot of effort into using that netting to keep it out. I mean, it's an excellent question, since insects, when they want to get somewhere, will get somewhere. But that was the goal, was to keep them from losing more pollinators the next year. Yeah, yes. Excellent question. So let's say you have a drought midsummer, and all of a sudden forage drops off and they don't have enough to keep the colony going or to provide enough food to rear a queen. That's an instance in which the colony might not produce a queen, or if there's a heavy disease load in the system, circumstances like that. Yeah. So there's lots of vulnerability in the bumblebee life cycle. Yes. They don't actually need to drink water for themselves. They get the water needs that they need from nectar. Sometimes bumblebees, like honeybees, will use water to do evaporative cooling if it gets too hot within their colony. So having access to water can be handy, but is not always essential. Yeah.